So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be starting in about 60 seconds or so while we wait for folks to file on in from the waiting room. Also keeping an eye on Facebook to make sure we're live there, and we are. As people file in, for those who feel comfortable, no obligation whatsoever, no pressure, but for those who are comfortable doing so, feel free in the chat to let us know where you're joining us from tonight. So let us know what city or town you're watching from. That's always fun. And I hope everyone enjoyed the 65-degree weather today. That was a pleasant surprise. Or I guess we knew that was coming for a little bit, but still surprising nonetheless. All right, Tewksbury, Framingham, Rockport, Burlington, Andover. Wonderful, wonderful. All right, we'll give it another 10 seconds or so before we get going here. If anyone else would like to type in the city or town they're joining us from, that'd be great. North Reading. All right, Andover, Phoenix, Arizona. I think Pat's going to win for furthest away here. Haverhill, Newton, keep them coming. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you all so much for coming. We're expecting a little bit more filing in, but out of respect for those that are here on time, we'll get moving. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. And I want to thank the libraries in Andover, North Reading, North Andover, and Wilmington for partnering with Tewksbury for tonight's event. I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring tonight's event. And I'd also like to thank Jane from Wellesley Books for being our official bookstore partner for tonight's event. And you'll all be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey and also a link to Wellesley Books to purchase an autographed copy of Bob and Alan's book. And I'll also drop that link into the chat a couple of times during tonight's presentation. And just a reminder that 10% of each book sale benefits all of the participating libraries. So little added extra incentive for you to purchase a copy of this great book. We are live on Facebook. I encourage anyone watching on Zoom to give it a like on Facebook and share it on your Facebook page. That would be greatly appreciated so we can expand our reach. And we are going, just to set expectations, I anticipate this program lasting approximately an hour. I'm going to stop rambling in a couple of minutes, and then Bob and Alan have a wonderful presentation that they've made. That'll probably go 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that during the presentation, and we'll make sure to try to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end of this program. All right, so let me get to the good stuff here. We're joined tonight by Dr. Robert Krim and Alan Earls for a presentation based on their acclaimed new book, Boston Made: From Revolution to Robotics, Innovations That Changed the World. We're going to enjoy a fascinating look at how Boston became and remains a global center for innovation, told through many of its world-changing inventions. So Boston Made tells the remarkable story of how Boston has spawned an unparalleled number of world-changing innovations, encompassing every area of human endeavor in its 400-year history. The book is built around 50 innovation stories and images that author and innovation expert Dr. Robert Krim and co-author Alan Earls have chosen from a list of more than 400 critical innovations uncovered in a 12-year study involving hundreds of experts. And I'll skip ahead for the sake of time, and I don't want to be too redundant here. So Dr. Krim is the founder and leader of the Boston History and Innovation Collaborative, for which he assembled a multi-university research team who worked with hundreds of organizations and businesses, studying nearly 500 innovations that changed the world and that were developed here in Greater Boston. That research involved into 4 centuries of innovation, which is a permanent exhibit at Boston Logan International Airport. And Dr. Krim has a BA from Harvard and earned a master's in US history, a master's in economics, and a joint PhD MBA from Boston College. So if there's any question as to who's the smartest person on the Zoom call is, I think we know here. A professor at Framingham State University, Dr. Krim founded the Entrepreneur Innovation Center. And certainly, last but not least, Alan R. Earls is a Boston area writer who has covered high-tech innovation for more than 30 years. He has authored or edited more than a dozen books on innovative enterprises such as Polaroid, Digital Equipment Corporation, and Raytheon, as well as regional histories. So all of us watching live on Zoom and Facebook, and those that will watch on demand on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Bob and Alan for joining us here tonight. And Bob, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. So I am Dr. Bob Krim, as mentioned, and I have a question for you. Have people told you that Boston is really a unique city? Well, I have found it that way. And figuring out Boston's story is something that really makes me tick. As Robert mentioned, I'm trained in history and economics and innovation, and spent even beyond 12 years, a total of 20 years, working with a large network, really of hundreds of people, figuring out why Boston might be so innovative, and then how best to tell that story if it's in fact valid. And as mentioned, I headed up something which I had started called the Boston History and Innovation Collaborative, that brought a lot of very interesting people together over a number of years. And been teaching for these last 8 years. And the last 3 years have been working with my colleague, Alan Earls, on the two of us writing this book together, Boston Made. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. The North of Boston Public Libraries, I really applaud you for bringing together such a group. We're here really to tell you some stories tonight. And in addition, we love questions and look forward to your questions as we go. So let me get started with my first story. It's one you may have heard of. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. And he is somebody who was brought up in Edinburgh and lived there for a while after growing up, and worked and studied in London, and then went to Brantford, Ontario along the way. He had lived in 3 different cities and 3 different nations for 6, 7, 8 years. And yet, how come he invented his main thing in life, really, the telephone in Boston? What allowed him to do it here rather than someplace else? He came to Boston in his mid-20s, and he was trained by his father, who was very famous in what's called vocal physiology, in helping deaf students to learn to speak, particularly articulately. But he also was hot on technology, and he was into the telegraph. The telegraph was about 30 years old in 1875 when Bell came to Boston. And it was a period when a number of people in the telegraphy business, and there's a picture here of one of the main buildings in Boston, which was a focus of telegraphy. They were working on something which they called the harmonic telephone. I guess we'd call it telegraph 2.0 or something of that nature. And while he was teaching, he was really drawn to make contact with people who were working in this building, which is which was on Court Street. It's where the John F. Kennedy Federal Building is now in downtown Boston, who know that. One of the people who he met early on as he was trying to make contact with the telegraph people in Boston was a guy named Thomas Watson, a young man. Another was Charles Williams, whose name was on that building, who was head of a company that made telegraphs and did research on it. Bell, over his first year here, began to move from the harmonic telephone to something else that intrigued him, which was, would it be possible to send the human voice over an electric wire, over a telegraph wire? Bell was a dynamic entrepreneur himself. He was willing to jump through hoops, known and overcome some unknown barriers in order to try to find out about this. And he had hired one of the garrets that was at the top of that red brick building that Williams owned. And he persuaded Watson to leave working for Williams on the first floor and to move up with him to the garret so that they could work on this question of sending words over power lines. Watson was a good model maker, was good at making models actually work, and Bell was more the scientist, more the theorist of it. They made a great pair, and they brought in others. One person they brought in was a man named Lewis Latimer. Latimer was the son of stowaway slaves from South Carolina who had come to Boston in the early 1840s. And Latimer had become a patent draftsman and was somebody who liked to work with people like Bell or Williams in the telegraph business. In any case, in order to bring Latimer on part-time and in order to bring Watson on, Bell, who was working part-time, was working for BU, but for not a wonderful salary at the time, Bell needed to find somebody to help finance his work. And the person who he had been introduced to was Gardner Hubbard. Mr. Hubbard's daughter was deaf and was a student of Bell's at the time. And through Hubbard, he also met a man named Thomas Sanders, another financier of new technical things in Boston at the time. In any case, one day while they were working on this was the anniversary of was just yesterday, March the 10th in 1876. Bell was working at his table in one large room, and in between the two large rooms was a pretty solid wall and a door, and they were pretty thick. And Bell, as you can see in this drawing made afterwards, had spilled some of the acid that was at the bottom of the implement that we would later call a receiver. And Bell sort of yelled out to Watson, Watson, come here, I need you. And in this case was because he had spilled some of the acid on his pants. And Watson was able to hear this, which was a first, and came in to help out Bell in the situation that he was in. And that news that human voice had been sent over an electricized line was big news in the city at the time. People were attuned to that there was some real interesting work going on around the telegraph area in Boston. Boston and New York being the two leading places for new theoretical work on telegraphs at the time. In any case, the story had spread about being able to talk on what was not yet called the telephone. And it was heard by a number of people. And the news spread outside of Boston, and Bell was invited to a major World's Fair-like gathering in Philadelphia, which was the 100th anniversary, the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And Bell was asked to put on a presentation in the building to the left that you can see here. They had put on a few presentations in Boston and Cambridge in the spring of '76. And sometimes people could hear a voice coming through, sometimes not. It was still touch and go there. But they gathered in that large building, and there were some of the luminaries of the day. One of them was the president of American Telegraph. Another was the first head of the Smithsonian Institution. And yet a third person was the Emperor of Brazil, who was there to find out what were some of the major new manufactures and breakthroughs that people had. In any case, they heard the voice that was an assistant that day for Bell, and heard Bell's voice from about 30, 40 feet away. And this really created quite a stir. Enough of a stir so that when Bell returned to Boston a couple of days later, it was quite the talk of the city, and had been in the newspapers at that point. And one of the people who approached Bell was his old friend Charles Williams, who said, I really would like to buy one of these instruments that you've made. And Bell was interested in selling them, and was able to get some help in making the first ones. And so Charles Williams got one receiver connected to the line for his first floor office in this building at 109 Court Street, and another put in the town of Somerville, which was about 4 miles away, where the number on the telephone was number 2, and that was to Williams's wife who lived there. So I guess he wanted to call to say how late he was coming home or not, or something of that sort. I really don't know. But in any case, the thing had spread to telephones being sold. That led to Queen Victoria, about 6 or 8 months later, inviting Bell to come to London to do a demonstration there. And Bell did that. And within 4 to 6 months, the telephones were now being made in London and sold. So we find a situation that is one that we noticed in many of the innovations that we researched in Boston during the 2000 and 2010 time, which is that there were 5 drivers out of about 25 that we were researching that seemed to have occurred in conjunction with a telephone and with a number of other of the major new Boston innovations. First was that it was a dynamic entrepreneur, in this case, Bell, who was willing to jump through hoops to make this thing work. Second driver was that there was a vibrant network of people working the cluster of people who were around telegraphy in Boston at the time. So the second driver, vibrant networking. The third was that there were early adopters, or people who were representing the local demand for the new product, the new invention at the time. Not all cities where things were invented did people really want to buy them and adopt them. In Boston, it was the case. The fourth was that there was local funding available. There were financiers who were willing to invest in new, relatively untried technologies, as well as other areas besides technology. And fifth was that the product could be sold nationally. And in fact, it was sold, as I pointed out, in London in within 8 or 10, 12 months of it having been first sold to Williams in Boston. 4 of these 5 were local. And in our research, we came to call this first something called the bump rate, which was is a phrase and that was used at Harvard in terms of where to build the scientific labs. And we then came to see that it was not just about people in the vibrant network bumping into each other, but really it was the bumping and the connecting with people that made a difference. And so that was true of the invention of the telephone, and it's one of the reasons why I chose it to be the first here that we talk about tonight. These 5 drivers were more intense if they worked together on the innovation. And so we'll come back to this a little bit later on, but the 5 drivers were more than the sum of the parts. We've called this sometimes the secret sauce of innovation in Boston, these 5 drivers. And I guess one question you might be thinking about or asking about right now is, so why am I telling you this particular story? And I'm telling it to you because this one embodies the 400 that we have followed in Boston. That there really has been a proclivity for new innovations coming about. And we have focused not on all 400 that have been found. In fact, there's a larger number, as I'll mention soon, but we got funding, particularly about 6 years into this, to follow in detail 50 stories of innovations that we felt were worthy of getting a much fuller story about. And as mentioned earlier, that we worked with literally hundreds of people on this research, and had many interns from the various universities in the area working with us. I think we totaled 500 interns over about 10 years. And the project was overseen, this Boston History Collaborative, by a prestigious group of trustees drawn from the leadership of Greater Boston. It included community representatives like the sheriff of Suffolk County, Andrea Cabral, a number of college presidents, and the provost at Harvard, and the chancellor at MIT, and others, as well as people from a number of other universities and companies in the city. The chairman of the Mass Historical Society, Henry Lee, was one of those people. And we had gone out and spent a while asking people, so what is it about Boston that you think really makes this one of the more innovative cities in the world? And people came up, and we spent probably a year looking at a number of theories, which we eventually boiled down to about 24 different theories about why the innovation occurred. Some was because of the universities, others were because of immigration to the city, public education, things like that. So over time, we didn't reach only 400 innovations. We actually got up into the 600 range. And then we decided we really needed to make sure that we were clear about what we're talking about in terms of innovation. And by being clear, we said that an innovation that we were looking at had to originate in either Greater Boston or Massachusetts. Many times things moved around the state in its early stages. And that it had changed the nation or the world. We weren't just looking for what was a local innovation that really made a difference, but one that was one that we could show really had changed the world. And it had become a household word in many places, not just in the United States, but in South America or England or China or other places. And so we're looking for innovations that weren't just an early motor car company, but one that really had something that was changeable. And as I said, we focused on 50 and went into a lot of detail on them. And we're continually looking for the why of these innovations. I found myself, this is about 6-7 years into it now, very anxious about this question, because we had put together a tour called the Innovation Odyssey that was in partnership with the Museum of Science in the city. And we were getting TV crews from London, from Rome, from Tokyo, asking us to take them on the tour. And I was beginning to think, somebody's going to be asking me, why is it that Boston seems to have so many innovations? This was sort of a surprise. We knew there were a number in the city, but not the level that we're up to. And the breadth of the innovations as well. They weren't just in technology, they were as well in health and sometimes in education and finance. I was looking for some other analogy. What is this about this city? As I said, I enjoyed looking at what makes a city tick, and this is a city I'd grown up on. I'm a native of it, but what else was like it? And so one other area that I had been asked to study for the work at Logan Airport was how many Nobel Prize winners had done a substantial piece of their work in the Boston area. And it turned out that about 170 of the Nobel Prize winners had. And I then said, well, so let's compare that to the United States and to other nations. And we found out that the United States, I'm sorry, the United States, not the United Nations, that the United States would be number one, but Boston would come in as the second highest nation, if you would, in terms of developing the work of Nobel Prizes that they had been awarded for. And that the United Kingdom and Russia and France and Italy and other places would all be less than Boston. So maybe we weren't that crazy with the research that we were doing, but it certainly felt like we were way out in left field at times with putting this idea forward. In any case, with Bell, we've just looked at one of the 90 or 100 ones in technology. And Alan is going to report on one that he's done a lot of work on, one in healthcare. So let me turn it over to Alan.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, this is the very special story of Dr. Sydney Farber, another one of these very driven innovators who refused to accept no for an answer when he thought he saw something that could be created or invented. In the late 1940s, Dr. Farber was on the staff of Children's Hospital in Boston. In the course of his work, he came into contact with a great number of patients suffering from childhood leukemia, which at the time was more or less a death sentence, with 85% of those afflicted not surviving. The situation bothered him as it would anyone, but fortuitously he had an insight, one that he immediately seized on. He knew that malignant cells in bone marrow are the origin point for the disease, and he had also learned that the nutrient folic acid is critical to bone marrow growth. He then made the intuitive leap that if folic acid could be suppressed or eliminated in patients with malignant bone marrow cells, perhaps leukemia itself could be stopped or reversed. Although he had no research lab and really no funding, he did have the attention of some of the staff pediatricians anxious to help their patients. And he was able to come up with a chemical, aminopterin, which did block folic acid. And when this material was administered to patients, the results were remarkable. In the first test group of 16 patients, 10 achieved remission. This was really the birth of chemotherapy for children and ultimately for adults, something which has saved or prolonged the lives of millions subsequently. With those kinds of results, one might have expected that Farber would have immediately been given accolades and support, but in fact, much of the medical establishment in Boston and beyond was dubious or even hostile. Farber, after all, was trained as a pathologist, not an oncologist and not a medical researcher. And with that underwhelming response from his medical colleagues, the prospect for funding seemed rather dim. But fortuitously, members of the Variety Club, a show business affiliated charity organization, met Dr. Farber, toured his lab, and showed a great interest in supporting his work. This led first to the founding of the Children's Cancer Research Fund, and then about a year later, the Jimmy Fund. Jimmy, a pseudonym for an actual cancer patient, went on national radio shows bringing attention to the disease and to Farber's work. The Jimmy Fund itself became a permanent fixture, boosted by association with the Boston Braves, and then when the Braves moved to Milwaukee, by the Red Sox. An innovation in itself, since up to that time, sports teams had largely stuck to sports, not public service activities. Farber died in the 1970s, but not before further enhancing his reputation as a researcher and fundraiser. Excuse me. And ultimately building a research and treatment team. The Children's Cancer Research Center was renamed in his honor, and then in the 1980s to Dana Farber in honor of a large gift from a philanthropist by the name of Dana. And it's now a world-class institution that's very, very well known nationally and internationally. Oops, excuse me. Like Bell, Farber's childhood leukemia breakthrough was characterized as well by the 5 drivers that Bob discussed earlier. He was himself a brilliant, unstoppable entrepreneur, MD. After his stellar breakthrough with the 10 remissions out of 16, he had a whole series of local MDs coming to him in his unimpressive basement office. That was the beginning of a vibrant network. The second driver, there was local demand too, of course, from doctors and parents of children with the illness. And the third driver, by the pediatricians and the parents, it was unstoppable. He was then able to get Jimmy funding set up, and then the Boston Braves, and soon a building, and eventually his own hospital, the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. The fourth driver, local funding, and last, his work led to a national and global demand for his chemotherapy and the establishment of a hospital. So again, you can see how these different drivers work together and ultimately culminate in national and global demand.
Great. So we've talked about two breakthroughs, but I'm sure people are interested in some of what might have brought you here tonight. There are so many others, and we have images of some of these here. The first one that comes to my mind is the breakthrough at Mass General Hospital of using anesthesia, which was the first time that you could actually put out a patient and do surgery on the body cavity. And so it helped to create modern surgery. So Morton was was the key person for that. The invention of basketball out in Springfield by James Naismith, and the invention of the sewing machine in Central Square by Elias Howe, the safety razor by King Gillette with his office above a fish market on Atlantic Ave in Boston, the first public school in the 1630s, Boston Latin, the first organ transplant in the world that was done at the Brigham, the microwave oven that you can see at the end over here at Raytheon in Waltham, the chocolate chip cookie in Whitman, Massachusetts, vulcanizing rubber. This is a picture of Charles Goodyear, who managed to invent it, and it was soon used for rubbers and raincoats and later for tires. And it goes on. In 1889, the city, on 1 year's notice, decided to change all the trolleys that were drawn by horses. 9,000 horses were then being used in Boston, over to a new electric-built horseless trolley. And in 18 months, Boston became the first city in the world to have that. And then based on that, we had the largest power station in the world and the most sophisticated generators built for systems. And with that, Boston got the first subway in the Western Hemisphere, the third in the world, which opened at Park Street in 1897. And it goes on with the first state to legalize marriage equality. And of course, most recently, the innovation of an anti-COVID vaccine at Moderna in Cambridge, and substantial work on the Pfizer one in Kendall Square, as well as the Johnson & Johnson one in Longwood area. So Boston is seen, I know my favorite innovation columnist in the Boston Globe, Scott Kersner, says, after listening to all these innovations, he said, Boston's really known for punching above its weight. I mean, who would have thought that this city would have been the center of so many of these things? So Boston is also a center for what we call social innovation. And social innovations are one where social norms are dramatically changed in how people live and work with each other. One of those was the marriage equality one that I was just talking about. Another social innovation is one that occurred several hundred years ago. Massachusetts was the first of the 13 states to abolish slavery. Why here? And again, this is a third of our stories. Massachusetts, Boston founded 1630. The first enslaved Africans were brought here 8 years later. And here a picture of some of the slave quarters in Medford, right near Tufts University, by the royal family, one of the wealthiest families. So how did this happen in Massachusetts? Well, soon, as most of you know, the beginning of the American Revolution was here, and in March of '76, the British were driven out of Boston, and a new constitution, one not the colonial charter, but a new constitution was needed. And they asked John Adams, when he returned from being ambassador to France, to write the preamble to that constitution. And in it, he wrote, "All men are born free and equal." And so when the Constitution was introduced, they set up a new way of approving a charter, since it wasn't the king who was giving them that charter. And they asked that the people in Massachusetts vote whether they wanted this Constitution or not. And in the smaller towns, as well as the bigger towns and little villages in the state, the Constitution was read. In the town of Sheffield, out in Western Massachusetts, there was an enslaved African-American woman who listened to the words of Adams being read that day, that she was standing underneath a tree in front of the house where she had been a slave. And she began to think about this, and she decided that she would secretly get in touch with a local lawyer that she heard might be an abolitionist, a guy named Theodore Sedgwick. And Sedgwick helped to bring a case in the local town against the slave owners. And that jury decided that Mum Bet was being held illegally. The owners then appealed to the case to the new state Supreme Court. And that state Supreme Court ruled that by the notion of the preamble having become part of this first Constitution, and even though this was 1781 and the Battle of Yorktown had not yet been won, that that slavery was forever abolished in Massachusetts. And it was linked to another case of a African-American male. There's the actual writing of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of that innovation being put into effect. So I won't go through all the drivers on that, since we're running on a little bit in time, but it is interesting that in New York State, that it took 50 years after Massachusetts before slavery was abolished there. Three things that we really found major in the work that we've done over these 20 years and plus. The first is the sheer number and breadth of innovations, that 400. We know that there are others out there that we haven't studied, but it's really, we feel, unmatched. The second thing is the question of why this area has been so filled with innovations. And there we think that these 5 top drivers tell us a lot of why that is the case. And then the third conclusion that we've reached that we haven't talked about, maybe it's something that you might have a question about, is that in spite of the fact that we've been so innovative, our economy has collapsed 4 different times over the last 4 centuries that we've studied. And I won't go through each of these, but the first one was in the 1640s, the second one around the time of the Revolution, the third with the collapse of the wooden sailing ship economy, and the fourth, the textile and shoe industry. In any case, each time it's come back with new and major innovations, most recently by electronics and the mutual funds and biotech, as we've seen so recently. So that's what we have, and our book is now Boston Made: Revolution to Robotics, and $25 at bookstores. It's being sold online by Amazon, and the electronic version is I think $12. But we very much want to thank the libraries north of Boston and thank Robert Hayes for inviting us to speak tonight. We love questions, and we hope there's some questions about to be raised here.
Great. So thank you so much, Dr. Krim, and thank you so much, Alan. So in the chat right now, I just put the direct link to purchase an autographed copy of Boston Made from Wellesley Books. It'll be autographed, and 10% of each sale will benefit the participating libraries. But certainly get the book wherever you want. Yeah, so folks, get some questions into the chat. I have a couple of questions, Dr. Krim. So you had a slide that had like 15 inventions, and you know, you kind of took 10 seconds on each one. But I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on several of them. I think I wrote them all down. The first one that I think might be of interest, because Raytheon has locations both in Tewksbury and Andover,
absolutely,
would be the microwave oven. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I happen to know the microwave oven well because my father worked at Raytheon and was very close with the main inventor of it. It was invented in 1946, 1947, and it came about because Raytheon had been making radar and particularly the magnetrons for the radar during World War II, when the British facilities had been bombed during the war. And Raytheon in 1946 had just had to lay off about 80% of its workforce. And Percy Spencer there was an inventor, a guy who had never finished 3rd grade, but a brilliant man. And he recognized that every time that he walked by the magnetron tube, which had been developed in part at Raytheon, that he had a chocolate bar that he liked to eat in the afternoon, and it melted. And so one day he said, and my dad happened to have been there that day, Percy said, so what about if we get some popping corn and see whether that might get melted or exploded or something like that? And lo and behold, they got a bag of popcorn, and put it in front of the magnetron, and it just began popping. And with that began a lifetime marriage between popping corn and microwave ovens. So anyhow, a little bit on the microwave. I am old enough and lucky enough that we got one of the 4 trial microwave ovens, and I sat in front of the when I was 4 years old, in front of the this experimental device that was 5 feet tall and weighed many pounds. So that's one, and it's a long story.
And then one of the last ones you mentioned on that slide, or perhaps it was the last one, was the COVID-19 vaccinations, the Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. And so did you say that all 3 were worked on in Boston? I wasn't aware that was the case.
All the for the Johnson & Johnson has been at Beth Israel and the virology lab there, and most of the critical work on the early part of the mRNA work and stuff like that was done at Beth Israel over on Longwood Avenue. And Pfizer has some major early stage labs in Kendall Square, not too far from where Moderna is. So the one that we haven't done a scientific study ourselves of exactly how much of each of those, but yes, you know, really, if one leaves it only at the Moderna one, here we have another major world-changing innovation coming out of the Boston area.
And so, Dr. Krim, you know, what role do you think government plays in all these innovations, if any? You know, Massachusetts is sort of known for its high cost of living and high cost of doing business, and I think there's, you know, thoughts of bureaucracy and red tape, and sometimes it's not seen as the most business-friendly state. But at the same time, all these companies are thriving with all sorts of innovations over the years. What role do you think government plays?
Government plays a role, and we've seen it in a couple of innovations. The development of the subway never would have happened here without that, and it was the then mayor of Boston, Nathan Matthews, in the 1890s, who really was the one who made the main breakthrough. And so government leadership makes a difference in many ways. Governor Deval Patrick, with the coming behind biotech with $1 billion in help that the state was making, did make a difference on that. So there are roles, but we have found that it is not as large a role as many of us might have thought by looking at each of these innovations individually. It's there, but it's more of a supportive role without which some of them wouldn't have happened, but not necessarily the creative genius of the telephone or this or that makes the difference in it. So very good question, very good question. And I have worked in the public sector most of my career. And so I've been surprised at what I've learned in studying this over time. And I think Alan as well. Alan, do you have any thoughts?
I was just going to add, Bob, you often also cite the fact that Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Kendall Square is located, was pretty much the first place in the world to look at biotech research and address public concerns about whether that was safe or not. They put in place early regulations, so there's a framework that companies knew they could count on. Those things were done up front, and it made it a magnet. People knew they could come here, and they knew what to expect. which was very helpful.
And Michelle raises a good point in the chat, saying that academia played a major role in the Boston area with MIT, Harvard, Tufts, etc.
Absolutely. There's 60 universities. I happen to work at one, which is a state university in the area, and it really makes a difference. In fact, one of our graduates from Framingham State is the woman who invented the chocolate chip cookie. So, in our book cover,
yes,
is that universities play a very large role in bringing lots of people here and helping them move ahead. And at the same time, our research tends to lead to that the universities play a role in aggregating so many people who are interested in the sciences and in lots of other areas in healthcare and finance and otherwise. It's not always the creative spark, but it is bringing the people together. And so in that sense, it's a large role, but it didn't come out in the top 5. It more came out in like number 10, number 11, number 12, out of 30. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think, I've been staring at that chocolate chip cookie for the past 10, 15 minutes. I think I'm going to have a Toll House cookie when I get home. A couple more questions for you, Doctor. So you probably have gotten this question a lot, or will get this question a lot, but your book focuses, I believe, on 50 innovations.
Exactly.
You selected out of 400 to 500. What was innovation number 51? What was the one that didn't make the cut? What was the closest one to making the book?
Well, literally, it was the decision last spring of, will the COVID vaccine come out of Boston? But the book was going to press in June, and there's no way that we wanted to say that was going to be it and have it not be it. So much of our lives depend on keeping hope alive that way. So, that was one that that I really would have liked to have seen, but it isn't. So. But anyhow, I don't have another one off the top of my brain.
That's okay. At this point. And not related to your book, although somewhat related to your book, but in your bio it mentioned that you have a permanent exhibit at Logan Airport, and I haven't been to Logan in over a year now, but I'm wondering, I probably have walked past it several times. Where in the airport is it located?
Yes, it's in a long corridor that goes from Terminal C, the JetBlue, all the way over to the international Terminal E. And our 50 top innovations, about 42 are the same ones that are in the book.
Oh.
We tell the story in the book. The nice thing about it is that we have images and this and that, and we can tell a lot longer story on the innovation corridor there, the innovation hall. So you might see it. It's if you look from Terminal C over to Terminal E, you have to have bought a ticket and be on your way traveling someplace to see it. So.
All right. Well, we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I will say, I think we've set a record tonight. We had about 150 people register. I think we had 60 or 70 at our highest point, and we only elicited one question. So let's do better next time, folks. But I do know that a lot of folks stuck on the call. I'm sure a lot of folks really got a lot out of this and really enjoyed it. If you did enjoy the presentation, let us know in the chat. Let Alan and Bob know what you thought of tonight's event. And Bob and Alan, do you guys have any last words before we wrap up for the night?
It's a big thanks to you. Big thanks to you guys in the middle of this pandemic, getting 4 or 5 towns to collaborate and cooperate and get a great crowd for a book we're so thankful about it, and it shows that creativity that makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to be able to get out there and share, and we really appreciate the opportunity. We've worked in relative isolation on this for a few years, and occasionally we've looked at each other and said, what are we doing with this for? So it's great to finally be out and sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So please tell your neighbors and friends about the book. We're only hope that it's of use to so many people in the Boston area.
Karen says, great talk, bravo. Patricia says, excellent, cannot wait to read the book. Sharon says, very interesting, thank you. Judith says, thank you, this was very cool, very interesting. And Xing Shang says, fantastic. All right, so we will call it a night at 8 o'clock. Want to thank Dr. Krim, want to thank Alan, want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want to thank Andover, Chelmsford, North Reading, and Wilmington for co-hosting this event. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring this event, and I want to thank Wellesley Books for being our official bookstore partner. I want to remind all of you to look for an email tomorrow morning with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and a link to purchase an autographed copy of the book. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone enjoys this 65-degree weather, and I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks so much. And thank you, Bob. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Yes.
Bye, guys.